The lake behind my house used to be quiet, peaceful. My wife and I built our home there for that very reason. But last summer, it started to stink. Not just a little. Not just rotten leaves. This was different. My dog wouldn't even drink from it. Then the fish started dying, and the HOA, they said I was being dramatic, until the EPA showed up and traced their secret dump site straight back to my backyard. The lake behind my house was my sanctuary. Tucked behind a dense line of pine and cedar, it reflected the sky like a still glass mirror. I used to sit out there for hours just listening to the cicadas, letting the wind off the water wash over the ache in my bones. After Janet died, it was the only place that didn't feel like it was closing in on me. We'd bought this house together after my retirement from the Army, 30 years in environmental logistics supply chain and civil engineering. She loved the lake, said it reminded her of childhood summers back in Oregon. When she passed, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. I thought if I stayed near the water, maybe she wouldn't feel so far away. But last summer, everything changed. It started with Scout, my old black lab. He'd been my shadow since the day Janet brought him home from the shelter. We had a routine mornings at the dock evenings, with a cane pole and a couple beers. That morning in early June, he ran down the slope like always, tail wagging. But as soon as he got close to the edge of the water, he stopped cold. Nose twitching, ears pinned back. Then he whined. I called to him, but he wouldn't budge. I walked down to the water's edge and caught a whiff of it. It hit me like a punch to the gut, an acrid chemical stench, masked just enough by the summer air to fool anyone not paying attention. Not sewage, not rot. Something wrong. Synthetic. Familiar in a way I didn't like. I'd smelled it in burn pits overseas, in contaminated storage bays, the kind of odor that made your skin itch and your stomach twist. I remember kneeling down and dipping my hand in the water. It felt normal, but when I pulled my fingers back up, they shimmered faintly. An oily sheen rippled across the surface in the sunlight, rainbow-tinted and wrong. I wiped my hand on my jeans and stared out over the lake. Something was in the water. That evening, I walked the perimeter. My property backs up to a wooded buffer zone which the HOA had always insisted on maintaining as protected green space. No fences, just a line of scrubby trees between our backyard and the rest of the development. On the other side of those woods was a service road, the kind only landscapers and utility contractors used. But when I reached the far end of my yard, near the bend in the lake where the water narrows into a stream, I noticed a patch of ground that looked recently disturbed. The brush was trampled. A few tire tracks cut into the soft soil. Scout sniffed at the area and growled. I told myself it could have been anything. Kids, a four-wheeler, a landscaping crew cutting corners. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But then, over the next week, it got worse. First, the birds disappeared. Then the frogs went quiet. 3 days later, a family of fish floated belly up near the reed's bluegill and perched some with lesions on their scales. I collected a few in a net, took photos, and bagged one in a cooler for later. I may have retired, but my instincts hadn't. I ran a basic water test from an old field kit I'd kept from my engineering days. High phosphates, elevated nitrate levels, traces of heavy metals, nothing conclusive, but enough to raise red flags. The next morning I went to the HOA. Now I'd never had much to do with them. My wife used to go to the meetings, bring back the little newsletters, chuckle at the drama. I stayed out of it. I paid my dues, mowed my lawn, kept my mailbox painted. But that day, I walked into the office modular trailer-looking thing beside the community clubhouse and asked to speak with the board. Only Janice was there, HOA secretary, self-proclaimed gatekeeper, and the reason half the neighborhood had security cameras pointed toward their flower beds. Mr. McClellan, she said, barely looking up from her desk. Is there a concern with your property? I told her what I'd seen, the smell, the fish, the chemical traces. I showed her the photos from my phone. She made a face like she was humoring a confused uncle at Thanksgiving. It's summer algae, she said. Totally normal. Happens every year. No, I said firmly. This isn't algae. I've seen algae blooms. I've tested the water. Something's being dumped nearby. She rolled her eyes and slid her glasses down her nose. Well, unless you have evidence of criminal activity, I suggest you leave water management to the professionals. I am a professional, I snapped. Or I was. 30 years in military infrastructure oversight. I know a dump site when I see one. Her smile thinned. Mr. McClellan, you've always been a passionate homeowner. But we can't have false accusations disrupting community harmony. I suggest you drop this. I should have walked out, but I looked her in the eye and said, if the HOA has nothing to hide, why are you so nervous? That was the moment her expression changed. No more fake smile. Just a cold, flat stare. We take defamation very seriously here. Scout and I left my hands trembling from rage and something else, something heavier. I'd seen this before. Not in a suburban office, but in overseas command tents when someone realized a paper trail was about to surface. That night, I sat on the back porch watching the moon ripple across the poisoned water. I poured myself a whiskey and turned the cooler's latch. The fish I'd saved was starting to rot. I sealed it tighter and made a decision. They weren't going to gaslight me into silence. They messed with the wrong man. The following morning, I drafted a simple email with attachments, photos of the dead fish, the water test readings, and a short description of what I'd observed. I CC'd the HOA board's official address, even copied Janice directly, just to be thorough. I kept the tone professional. No accusations, just facts. I even offered to pay for independent testing out of my own pocket, as long as the board would permit access to the adjacent greenbelt and stream corridor. I got no response. Not a single acknowledgement. So 2 days later, I printed out a few flyers and pinned them to the community bulletin boards near the tennis courts, at the pool entrance, and inside the clubhouse foyer. The heading read, "Possible water contamination. If you've noticed a strange smell or dead wildlife, please contact me." I listed only my first name and a phone number, hoping to quietly gather data without stirring up too much alarm. I figured if a few neighbors had seen the same things, it'd be harder for the board to keep dismissing me. That night, someone tore every one of those flyers down. The next morning, I found a printed notice on my front door, standard HOA header, at the top, bold red lettering across the middle. One unauthorized posting in common areas, violation 3.14a, cease immediately. At the bottom was a threat of fines 100 per violation. I stared at the paper for a full minute, heart pounding. I wasn't a paranoid man by nature. My life had been built on structure, accountability, discipline. But this was deliberate. Scout sat beside me, tail thumping against the floorboards, as if he sensed my rising agitation. I reached down and scratched behind his ear, trying to collect my thoughts. They weren't just brushing me off. They were trying to bury the entire thing. Later that afternoon, I went down to the lake with a fresh bottle to collect another water sample. As I knelt by the edge, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned and saw Don Travers, HOA Vice President, part-time realtor, and full-time politician, striding toward me in his pristine golf shirt and mirrored sunglasses. "McClellan," he called, voice smooth as syrup. "We need to have a little chat." I stood slowly, bottle in hand. About what? He glanced around theatrically, checking if anyone was watching. "You're causing a stir," he said, lowering his voice. "Janice says you've been handing out flyers, talking to people. That's not how we do things here." "How do you do things here, Don?" I asked. "Ignore pollution until someone ends up in the ER." He exhaled, like a man being very patient with a child. "Look, I get it. You're passionate. You served your country, and we respect that. But this is a community. We need calm, not panic. There's no evidence of anything serious." I cut him off. "Then why are the fish dying?" He didn't answer. "Why did my neighbor's son end up with a skin rash after swimming here? Why are you threatening fines instead of investigating?" His jaw clenched. "You're making this personal." "No," I said, stepping forward, voice hard. "You are." For a long moment, we just stood there, two men who knew exactly what the other was trying to do. Then he gave me a smirk I won't forget. "If you don't like how this neighborhood is run," he said, "maybe it's time you thought about selling." And with that, he turned and walked off, whistling like he'd just solved world peace. I stood there, shaking the bottle clutched tight in my fist. Scout growled low beside me. The urge to throw that sample into the woods burned hot in my chest. But I didn't. I screwed the cap on tight and walked back up the slope. That night, two things happened that changed everything. First, I got a call. The number was blocked. The voice was shaky female, whispering like she was afraid someone might hear. "I saw your flyer before they tore it down," she said. "You're right. My garden's dying and the water smells sweet, like antifreeze." "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer that. "Don't stop. Just be careful." Then she hung up. Second, just after midnight, Scout started barking like I hadn't heard him bark in years. Not playful, not excited, angry, protective. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. Scout was at the edge of the yard, snarling at something near the tree line. I shone the light into the woods, heart hammering. For a second, I thought I saw movement, someone retreating down the service path. But by the time I got to the fence line, there was nothing. In the morning, I found the sample bottle I'd left in the cooler outside had been tampered with. The cap was loose, the label peeled halfway off, just enough to make the contents inadmissible as proper evidence. I didn't sleep the next night. Instead, I dug out an old metal footlocker from the back of my garage. Inside were the remnants of a life I'd packed away after Janet's funeral: field manuals, encrypted drives, a busted tablet with a custom OS, and my last issued sat phone from my civilian contractor years. Useless now, but holding on to it had always made me feel like I still had one foot in the old world. And beneath it all, wrapped in plastic, was my contact book. I flipped through the pages, slowly, fingers shaking a little more than I'd like to admit. Old names, old numbers. Most of them were outdated. Some of them were gone. But one stuck out like a flare on a dark road. Marlene Garza, EPA Region 4, Atlanta HQ. She and I had worked together in Baghdad during a joint remediation operation after a chemical spill on a forward operating base. She was sharp, relentless, never bowed to pressure, not even when military brass tried to hide a contractor's mistake. I hadn't spoken to her in 10 years, but I picked up the phone anyway and dialed. To my surprise, she answered on the second ring. "Marlene," I said, voice cracking slightly. "It's Jack McClellan." There was a pause, then a breath, then Jesus. "I thought you were dead." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I might be," I said, "if I don't stop something real bad from happening." The call with Marlene didn't last long, but it lit a fuse I hadn't known I'd been carrying. She didn't ask for small talk. No catching up, no condolences for Janet. Just, "What are you seeing?" Start from the beginning. I gave her a precise timeline: what I smelled, what I saw, the fish, the rash on the neighbor kid, the water test results. I told her about the service road, the strange activity at night, the retaliation from the HOA. I could hear her typing as I spoke, fast and methodical. "You got coordinates?" she asked. I rattled them off. She whistled low. "You're near Lot 47B drainage basin, right?" "Downhill of it," I said. "About 200 yards. She was quiet for a beat. "That retention pond was decommissioned in '08. HOA was supposed to divert all runoff to the municipal system. Well, I said they didn't." Marlene sighed. "Send me everything you've got. Photos, logs, samples, whatever's intact. I'll flag it to the regional desk, but if it's what I think it is, we'll need a field team." I didn't sleep that night. Again. But this time it wasn't dread, it was motion. Momentum. I scanned and uploaded every document I had to a secure folder she gave me. I packaged the backup evidence, samples, photos, the video I'd caught on my trail camera of a blacked-out pickup rolling through the woods, and I shipped it overnight. Then I waited. In the meantime, the lake got worse. The color shifted from cloudy to an unnatural pale green, almost fluorescent under the sun. Foam began collecting near the banks, thick and greasy. A metallic tang hung in the air, sharp as blood. More wildlife disappeared. A family of ducks that usually nested near the reeds simply vanished. But it was the kids that finally made me snap. One afternoon, I saw a group of them splashing around near the north inlet, laughing, oblivious. Their parents set up lawn chairs just a few yards away, sipping lemonade, completely unaware they were letting their children swim in what amounted to slow poison. I walked up the hill and gently tried to warn them. Nothing aggressive, just a neighbor being concerned. The mom looked at me like I had 3 heads. My HOA said, "It's just seasonal algae," she chirped. "They put something in the water to treat it. Said it's safe." I blinked. "They're putting chemicals in the water." She hesitated. "That's what the email said. Just some kind of water clarifier." I felt the heat rise behind my ears. They didn't say which kind. She frowned. Why would they? I left before I said something that would have started a war. That night, I printed every HOA newsletter I had from the past year. Nowhere did they mention water treatments. No disclosure, no testing reports, no vendor names. That, in and of itself, was a violation of multiple local and federal ordinances. I knew what they were doing now. They weren't just hiding dumping. They were masking it, disguising pollution with cosmetic treatments to keep it visually acceptable, to avoid raising alarm. It was the kind of tactic I'd seen in the dirtiest war zones. Cover the smell color, the poison, and pretend the damage isn't there. A few days later, I got a message from Marlene. Encrypted. Field unit dispatched. Operatives arriving incognito. You'll know them when you see them. Sit tight. I wasn't sure what I expected. Hazmat suits, helicopters, sirens. What I got instead were two people in khaki utility clothes, one posing as a landscaping contractor, the other pretending to be a surveyor from the county wetland registry. They knocked on my door on a Tuesday morning like it was any other business visit. The woman, tall, lean, sharp eyes, introduced herself as Ellie, and the man, a stocky guy with an easy smile, went by Tom. Nice garden, Tom said, looking over my tomatoes. Nice cover, I replied. Ellie gave the slightest nod. We're going to map the runoff paths, collect air and soil samples, check historical drainage patterns. You're not to interfere. But if something happens, call the number on this card. I took the card. No name, just a number. I understood the implication. For 3 days, they worked the area. They blended in perfectly clipped bushes, chatted with passing residents, waved at HOA patrol trucks. But at night, I watched through binoculars as they traced topographical maps with red pencils, set out light-sensitive water buoys, and drilled quiet core samples near the stream bed. I'd been worried I was losing my mind, but watching them work, watching them move with the same urgency, the same precision I'd carried in my bones for decades, settled something inside me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. The evening of the third day, Tom slipped me a folded note as he passed by the mailbox. Inside, written in blocky engineer's print, was a single sentence. Whilst they're dumping through a secondary channel, not on any municipal plan. I stared at the words, heart pounding. A secret outflow. Hidden from public records. Likely connected to the old retention pond, Marlene had mentioned the one the HOA never actually decommissioned. My backyard wasn't just downhill, it was the end of their pipeline. Suddenly, everything clicked. The strange flooding 2 years ago. The unexplained algae blooms last summer. The spike in mosquito activity. All of it had been building to this. And they'd been using the HOA budget, the community trust, and the ignorance of homeowners to fund a cover-up. The next morning, my neighbor, Janice, the other Janice, not the HOA queen, knocked on my door with a strange look in her eyes. Jack, she said, hesitating. I saw some guys digging behind your lot last night. I played dumb. Digging. By the old maintenance fence, she whispered. They had flashlights. One of them had a clipboard. She looked scared. I think the HOA is up to something. I nodded slowly, realizing that more people were starting to notice. The dam of silence was starting to crack. The only question now was how long I could keep the HOA from realizing they were being watched, and whether the EPA would find enough before the board did something truly desperate. The thing about secrets is that they never stay buried forever, especially when they're leaking. It was around 2 a.m. on a Thursday when I finally decided to cross the line. Literally. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and took the narrow trail that led into the woods behind my property, the buffer zone the HOA called Protected Greenbelt, but never once seemed to maintain. Overgrown branches clawed at my jacket. Scout trotted silently beside me, alert, and focused ears twitching at every snap of twigs in the underbrush. I wasn't out there blindly. Earlier that day, I'd reviewed some old development plans I'd pulled from the city records office. They weren't easy to get. HOAs don't like handing over site maps to homeowners who ask too many questions. But I still had connections, and the clerk at the building department owed me a favor. The blueprints showed something unusual, a secondary drainage easement, one that curved behind the lake, and into the woods, ending at a mysterious maintenance channel that wasn't listed on any current infrastructure map. That's where I was headed. The moon was bright enough to light the path without much help, and the humidity hung low and thick, as if the forest itself was sweating. About 200 yards in, I started to hear it. A slow, steady trickle. Not the pleasant babble of a brook, something more industrial. Rhythmic. Controlled. I crouched low and moved carefully toward the sound. And then I saw it. A wide corrugated metal pipe half buried in the earth, poking out from beneath a slope of ivy and mud. It jutted from the base of a retaining berm, completely hidden from any obvious trail. No signage, no fencing, no warning. Just a gaping, rusted mouth, dripping a foul-smelling sludge into a shallow ravine that led directly into the feeder stream behind my lake. The stench was unbearable chemical rot, mixed with the metallic tang of decay. I took a step closer, careful not to disturb the ground, and clicked on my flashlight. The water wasn't just dirty, it was corrupted. Thick grayish-brown fluid oozed from the pipe in spurts, coating the rocks and earth in a slimy residue. The banks were discolored, the vegetation dead within a few feet in all directions. Insects buzzed around it sluggishly, as if drunk on toxins. My gut twisted. This wasn't stormwater runoff. This was controlled discharge. Somewhere up the line, someone was opening a valve. I pulled out my phone and started filming. I took close-ups of the pipe, the surrounding area, the fluid, and its flow path. I panned slowly to capture how the stream snaked toward the lake, framed by the silence of the forest and the distant flicker of porch lights. I capped it off with a voice memo, time-stamped and geotagged, narrating everything in calm, measured words, just like I'd been trained to do years ago in hostile zones. I needed proof, not just for the EPA, for myself. As I backed away, Scout froze. A crunch echoed behind us, soft, slow, unmistakable. Someone was watching. I killed my flashlight instantly and ducked low behind a thicket of brush, pulling Scout close. He didn't bark, he'd been trained better than that. Just a low growl deep in his throat as we both listened. Footsteps. Then a voice hushed and close. Damn it, the cameras moved again. I told them to bolt it down. Another voice. It's fine. We just need to get the flow reading and get out. Let's go. Flashlight beams danced through the trees, cutting narrow paths of white across the trunks. I held my breath. Scout didn't move. They were less than 30 feet away. 2 men. One in coveralls, the other in dark clothes and gloves. I could barely make them out through the brush, but I recognized the emblem on the back of one vest. Rosewood HOA Maintenance Services. So much for seasonal algae. They lingered for 5 minutes, adjusting something near the pipe, probably a sensor, maybe a secondary valve, and then left the way they came. I waited until their voices vanished into the night before moving. I didn't sleep after that. I went home, locked every door, and uploaded the footage to the drive I'd set up for Marlene's team. I wrote a full report, time-stamped everything, even included a map I'd hand-drawn from memory. By sunrise, it was all sent. By noon, I got an encrypted message from Tom. Confirmed visual. We're moving to Phase 2. That same day, the HOA posted an emergency community notice. Due to a routine assessment of our greenbelt drainage system, residents may notice temporary water discoloration. We assure you this is part of scheduled seasonal maintenance and poses no health risks. Please refrain from unauthorized access to maintenance zones. The gall. The same people who tore down my flyers were now gaslighting the entire neighborhood. I watched neighbors nod and shrug at the email like it meant nothing. Some even thanked the HOA for being so proactive. I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because I had something better. That afternoon, Ellie met me near the lake under the pretense of surveying fence damage. She kept her back to the houses as she spoke in a low, tight voice. You were right. It's a non-permitted discharge system routed from an illegal dump site. Dumping what I asked. She looked at me, jaw tense. Construction solvents, paint thinners, possibly expired pesticides, all regulated under EPA Title 40. Your HOA has been disposing of them on the cheap for years. Where are they getting them? Could be from internal projects. Could be outside contractors paying under the table. We're still pulling receipts. I exhaled, feeling the weight of it settle on my shoulders like armor. And the lake? Contaminated. Not critical yet, but sustained exposure is dangerous. If a child drank enough of it, she didn't have to finish. That night, I sat on the dock with Scout, watching the water shimmer under the moonlight. Except now I didn't see a sanctuary. I saw a crime scene. A place my wife once loved. A place children still swam. And now a place poisoned by greed. They had tried to hide it. They had threatened me, discredited me, and polluted something sacred. But they didn't know who I was. They thought I was just some lonely old man on a lake. They didn't know I'd built flood zones under mortar fire. They didn't know I could read a hydrological map like scripture. They didn't know I had friends at the federal level who still owed me favors. But they were about to find out. 2 days after I found the pipe, the letter came. Not an email, not a knock on the door, a certified envelope, hand-delivered, marked with bold black letters. Cease and desist. Inside was a 4-page document on HOA letterhead, complete with legal jargon, formal threats, and all the arrogance you'd expect from people too used to throwing their weight around unchecked. The letter accused me of disseminating false and defamatory claims, of trespassing on HOA-maintained property, and of inciting community unrest with unsubstantiated allegations. It warned me to retract all statements, remove all posted content, and refrain from further interference with association operations. At the bottom, in neat blue ink, was a signature I knew well. Donald J. Travers, HOA Vice President. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in one hand and a glass of water in the other. My pulse didn't race. My jaw didn't tighten. I just stared at it like I was back in a forward operating base, staring down an incoming threat. The only thing I felt was clarity. They were scared. I had crossed a line, and for the first time, so had they. Scout laid his head on my foot, sensing the shift in me, quiet and still. I pulled out a manila folder I kept in a drawer near the fridge, labeled in my handwriting. Contingencies. Inside were copies of property surveys, photographs, legal statutes, and most importantly, my deed. I knew my rights, and I knew the law. The spot where I filmed the pipe, technically still my land. Years ago, the HOA had tried to expand their utility access zone behind several lots, mine included, but they never filed the proper easement paperwork. The city denied the request, and it never showed up in county records. I kept a copy of the denial letter in that same folder. I wasn't trespassing. They were. So I did what any rational man with nothing to lose and everything to fight for would do. I lawyered up. I called an old friend, Clay Michaels, former JAG officer turned environmental defense attorney, now running a boutique law firm in Atlanta. We hadn't spoken since Janet's funeral, but when I told him what I was sitting on, he cleared his schedule. By the next morning, Clay had filed a formal response to the HOA's cease and desist, citing property rights violations, unlawful discharge under the Clean Water Act, and retaliatory intimidation against a whistleblower. He included photos, GPS data, and a statement of interest from the EPA confirming an active federal investigation. He faxed it directly to the HOA board. That afternoon, Janice showed up at my door. Not HOA Janice, the other one. Janice Reynolds, the gardener I'd spoken to weeks earlier. She was shaking, pale, clutching something in her hand. I didn't know where else to go, she said. I let her in and poured her some tea while Scout stayed close, tail thumping gently, a warm reassurance. Janice handed me a folded document, another newsletter from the HOA. But this one wasn't public. It was marked internal use only. She'd found it stuck between boxes in the clubhouse storage room while looking for pool signs. It was a communications memo, a crisis playbook, titled Mitigation Strategy, Water Quality Complaints. The memo outlined a plan to control narrative perception, minimize press engagement, and deny direct acknowledgement of contamination until outside agency involvement is confirmed. They'd planned for this. They knew. Janice looked at me, eyes wide. They've been dumping since before we moved here. I found references to tank orders dated back to 2016. They used community funds to rent unmarked trucks. I swallowed hard. You sure? I saw the invoices. Some were under fake vendor names. My phone buzzed. It was Clay. You're going to want to sit down, he said. I just got a call from an HOA attorney. Not a firm I recognize. They're lawyering up fast. Let them, I replied. They're already drowning. By the next morning, things started to spiral fast. An anonymous tip leaked the story to a local reporter someone Marlene had flagged weeks earlier. The reporter called me for comment. I didn't give one, but I didn't deny anything either. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing. The clubhouse closed suddenly. A landscaping crew was seen removing something from behind the fence. Cameras caught them hauling out barrels, unlabeled, rust-stained, loaded into the back of a maintenance van. One neighbor said she saw a board member cursing into his phone in the parking lot, face white as chalk. Then came the email from the HOA board to all residents. In response to recent rumors regarding the integrity of our water management infrastructure, the HOA is conducting a thorough internal review. We ask for your patience and cooperation during this process. Please refrain from engaging with non-approved sources or third-party media inquiries. They were trying to contain it, but it was too late. Marlene's agents had already submitted a preliminary report. Soil contamination confirmed. Water flow mapping completed. Discharge tracked back to multiple sources, all tied to HOA property. And now, with a whistleblower on the inside and legal counsel backing me, we had what we needed. I stood on my back porch that night, the lake a black mirror beneath the stars. Scout sat beside me, his head resting on my leg. The wind carried the scent of pine, and something bitter underneath something chemical. But it didn't scare me anymore. It made me focused, because now the battle was no longer in the shadows. They tried to break me with legal threats, but I'd faced mortar shells. I'd buried friends in sandstorms. I'd fought red tape in the middle of war zones. And if they thought a suburban HOA was going to scare me off with a cease and desist letter, they had no idea who they were dealing with. When I joined the Army, my job wasn't glamorous. I wasn't out kicking down doors or flying choppers into hot zones. I dealt in logistics infrastructure, the boring details where the waste goes, how to move water across deserts, how to make sure people don't die, because someone forgot to label a barrel. But in that world, people like me are only boring until the toilets stop working or the drinking water turns brown. Then suddenly, we're the only people anyone listens to. That's why, when I first met Marlene Garza in Iraq, she was hauling a Geiger counter into a refugee camp while a dozen officers argued about who to blame. She didn't wait for permission. She just handled the truth. So when she picked up my call weeks ago and said, "Send everything," now I knew she'd be the tip of the spear. And now that her team had confirmed contamination, traced it upstream, and tied it to the HOA's illegal channels, things were about to escalate fast. I got the call on a Sunday. "Jack," she said, voice sharp and focused, "we've triggered a priority alert. The discharge volume at your lake exceeds the federal threshold for what's considered a hazardous incident under Title 40 of the Clean Water Act. This isn't just a civil issue now. It's criminal." I paused. Criminal? For who? For any board members who knew. For any contracted services that participated. For anyone who falsified maintenance reports, tampered with testing, or used HOA funds to fund illegal dumping. I let that sit. My fingers curled around the phone a little tighter. "I need you to stay quiet for now," she continued. "You've done your part. Let us take it from here." "I'm not backing down," I said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm calling. There's something you need to see." She sent a secured file link. Inside satellite images, infrared tracking of moisture lines, and a full audit trail linking purchases of industrial solvent disposal units that were never logged with the city. One shipment went directly to a warehouse leased under a Shell LLC, Rosewood Environmental Management, Inc., a company created just 6 months prior. Its registered agent, Donald J. Travers. They weren't just dumping, they were profiting from it. The HOA vice president had created a private contractor company, billed the HOA through fake invoices, then used that front to funnel waste products from nearby developments, probably taking bribes or side deals in the process. I stared at his name on the screen for a long time. It was personal now. That night, I saw something I hadn't seen in months: news vans. They parked 2 streets over, keeping low, pretending to film a human interest piece about suburban living. But I knew the look of embedded journalists when I saw them. Someone on the inside had leaked the EPA report. The next morning, an unmarked sedan parked outside the HOA office. 2 agents stepped out, 1 male, 1 female. No uniforms, just plain clothes, serious expressions, and federal credentials tucked under windbreakers. I watched from my porch as they knocked on the clubhouse door. Janice opened it, smiling at first until she saw the badges. Her smile froze. She stepped back like someone had knocked the wind out of her. The agents didn't raise their voices. They didn't flash handcuffs. They simply walked in and closed the door behind them. That's when the real unraveling began. Emails started going out, panicked, scattered messages to residents filled with vague legalese, and ongoing discussions with federal authorities. HOA meetings were suddenly postponed indefinitely. Don Travers stopped answering calls. Rumors spread fast. Some said he left town. Others said he'd taken a leave of absence. But I knew better. He was hiding. I started getting calls, too. Neighbors who had once ignored me were now dialing my number, their voices hushed, nervous. "Jack, did you know about this the whole time? Why didn't anyone tell us? My daughter's been getting nosebleeds. You think it's from the lake?" Some were angry. Most were just scared. But one call caught me off guard. It was from Elise Franklin, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived 2 doors down for 20 years. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I lost my dog last week, Jack. He got sick so fast. We thought it was cancer, but now I think maybe it was the water." I couldn't say anything. I just listened as she cried. Later that day, I met with Clay and Marlene via encrypted video call. Marlene's expression was unreadable. "We're pushing for an injunction," she said. "We want to freeze all HOA assets and seize any documentation related to property maintenance, waste disposal, and environmental management." Clay nodded. "If we can prove Travers used HOA funds to facilitate a crime, we can classify this as embezzlement and environmental fraud." "They'll blame it on bad record keeping," I said. "Say it was an accident, a miscommunication." "They can try," Marlene replied. "But when you hide pipes in the woods and falsify testing reports, that's not negligence. That's intent." The conversation turned to public disclosure. "There will be a town hall," she said, "EPA's protocol. We present the findings. Residents have a right to know." I leaned forward. "I want to speak." Marlene hesitated. "That's not usually—" "I'm not asking to represent you. I'm asking to speak as a homeowner, as the man whose land they dumped on, whose lake they poisoned. I want them to hear it from me." She nodded slowly. "All right, but be ready. This is going to blow up." I smiled. "That's the plan." 2 days later, the HOA clubhouse, usually reserved for bake sales and karaoke nights, was filled with folding chairs, TV crews, and grim faces. At the front stood a projector screen, a small table with bottled water, and a panel of EPA agents and legal reps. And me. The place was packed. Residents who hadn't shown up for a meeting in years were now standing shoulder to shoulder, murmuring, fidgeting, eyes wide. Marlene presented first. She was clear, calm, and brutal. She laid out every finding: the illegal dump site, the fake company, the misappropriated funds, the contamination levels, the health risks. She showed maps, graphs, photos. When the infrared satellite footage of the chemical plume moving from the dump site into the lake played, a hush fell over the room like a dropped curtain. And then she stepped aside. It was my turn. I walked to the front, slowly, my limp a little worse from the stress and long nights. I looked out over the sea of familiar faces, neighbors, skeptics, the same people who once thought I was crazy. I cleared my throat. "My name is Jack McClellan," I said, "and I live on the lake." Silence. "I'm not a scientist. Not anymore. I'm not a politician or a lawyer. I'm just a man who noticed something didn't smell right and refused to shut up about it." People shifted. A few lowered their eyes. I loved that lake. My wife loved it. She used to call it our little piece of peace, and for years we all thought it was just that, peaceful. I held up a photo, one of the dead fish, bloated and covered in lesions. "This is what peace looks like when greed poisons it." No one said a word. I tried to tell them. I begged the HOA to look, to listen. They told me I was overreacting. They threatened me, tried to silence me, but I didn't stop, because I knew deep down that they weren't just ignoring the truth. They were hiding it. I pointed to the projector screen where the image of the hidden pipe now lingered. "They used our money to poison our land, our water, our children." Someone gasped. A woman covered her mouth. "I don't want revenge. I want accountability. I want the lake restored. I want this neighborhood to remember what happens when we trust the wrong people with too much power." A beat of silence. Then someone started clapping. Another joined in. Then the room erupted. Not in cheers, but in something quieter, stronger. Agreement. Resolution. The tide had turned. In the weeks following the town hall, the quiet in our neighborhood felt like the kind that settles right before a storm cracks open the sky. HOA activity came to a grinding halt. The weekly email blasts turned into curt, pre-approved legal statements. Janice stopped showing up to the clubhouse entirely. Don Travers still vanished. Rumor had it he was in Florida. Others said Mexico. One person swore they saw him trying to sell his Audi at a gas station 2 towns over. But the lake, my lake, kept breathing. And so did the investigation. Marlene's team transitioned into a new phase: collection and prosecution. But they needed one last thing before moving forward: evidence from inside. That's when the agents started showing up, not with sirens or subpoenas, but disguised as what the HOA feared least: contractors. 2 new groundskeepers arrived in unmarked vans, clad in faded polos, khakis, and work boots. They introduced themselves to residents as Tony and Melissa, landscaping consultants brought in by the board to assess erosion control. Nobody questioned them. Not after weeks of chaos, not after the town hall. The HOA claimed they were reinforcing the property buffer zone, and the lie passed like all HOA lies do, easily, softly, without resistance. But I knew the truth. They weren't measuring bushes. They were measuring liability. Tony and Melissa weren't just EPA agents. They were part of a federal environmental crimes task force with backgrounds in forensic surveying and financial tracing. Their job: confirm the dump site scale match contaminated samples with documented purchase orders and quietly retrieve whatever paper trail Travers and the board hadn't destroyed. They worked fast and silently. Each morning they showed up before sunrise. Each evening they left after dark. They mapped out pipework using sonar probes buried in the soft earth. They photographed tire tracks, cross-referenced chemical patterns, even extracted core samples from beneath the concrete slabs near the maintenance shed. Every bolt valve and outdated pump told a story. They moved like ghosts. I only spoke to them once in passing. Tony was kneeling beside the edge of the stream, snapping photos of a small hatch hidden beneath a log. I walked Scout past him and gave a low whistle. "Clever spot," I said. He didn't look up. "Criminals tend to be lazier than they think," he replied. The next day, 2 city sanitation employees arrived, or at least that's what their jackets said. They inspected hydrants, tested the water line, and exchanged clipped nods with Tony and Melissa. But I recognized one of them, Dan Ortega, from a conference Marlene dragged me to years ago. He used to head the Clean Flow division in D.C. He was no local worker. He was a field operator with federal authority. They were closing in, and HOA didn't even see it coming. But the pressure was building. The neighborhood had gone from oblivious to restless. People wanted answers. They wanted restitution. Some demanded refunds on dues. Others wanted arrests. One afternoon, I watched a crowd gather outside the HOA office. No one manned the front desk. A note taped to the glass read, "Closed for board transition. Please direct all concerns to legal counsel." And then came the twist I hadn't expected. A resident stepped forward. Her name was Priya Shah, mother of 2. Engineer by trade, the kind of person who always brought too much dip to the block party and apologized for it. She requested an emergency HOA election. Apparently, she'd combed the bylaws and found a clause: if 51% of voting members signed a petition, the board could be dissolved and a new interim one elected. She'd already gathered over 60%. A week later, the vote passed. Janice was out, so was everyone else. And just like that, we had a new board, a temporary one made of residents who had never been in power before. And they wasted no time. They opened the books. The first week, they found over $150,000 in miscellaneous service fees paid to companies that didn't exist. They discovered forged maintenance reports, payments to cash-only vendors, and a bank account in a neighboring state that had no legitimate connection to any HOA operations. Then came the most damning piece. Melissa called me one evening with an update. "We found a safe," she said. "In the clubhouse." "No," she said, voice grim. "Behind the maintenance shed. Buried in the crawl space, sealed in a concrete block. Inside were binders, dozens. Itemized ledgers, chemical purchase receipts, delivery manifests, copies of falsified inspection forms, all signed off by Travers. This is what we needed," she said. They had him. Now all that remained was the arrest. But that's when it happened. A fire. The maintenance shed went up at 3:43 a.m. I woke to the smell of smoke and the distant wail of sirens. From my porch, I could see orange light flaring behind the tree line. Fire trucks rolled in minutes later, but it was already too late. The entire structure had collapsed. The timing was no coincidence. Melissa called me at 5:10 a.m., furious. "Arson," she said. "Accelerants used. Someone torched it to destroy records." "But you already had the evidence," I said. "We did," she agreed. "But they don't know that. Which means whoever did this is desperate and still here." A wave of nausea hit me. I thought of the night I saw shadows behind the pipe, of the agents I'd barely dodged in the woods. Someone was watching me. And if they'd already committed environmental crimes, and now arson, how far would they go to keep the rest buried? I checked the locks on my doors. I moved the trail cameras to face both entrances. And I started sleeping with a flashlight and a .38 revolver under my pillow. Not because I was afraid, because I was prepared. Let them come. I'd been outnumbered before, but this time I had the truth on my side. And now the whole damn country was about to see what happens when the people who were supposed to protect our homes poison them instead. 2 days after the fire, the EPA held a press conference. It wasn't flashy. No CNN cameras or podiums draped in flags. Just a plain white tent erected on the edge of our neighborhood's retention basin, the very spot the HOA once claimed was undergoing seasonal improvements. A small crowd gathered residents, a few local reporters, city officials in dull blazers. The air buzzed with humidity and tension. Marlene stood at the front, flanked by 2 other agents and a city councilwoman whose nervous smile said she hadn't expected this mess when she ran on better bike lanes. "We have concluded our field investigation into the contamination at Rosewood Estates," Marlene said into the mic. "Our findings confirm that hazardous chemical waste, including but not limited to construction solvents, pesticide concentrates, and petroleum byproducts, were unlawfully disposed of through unpermitted infrastructure controlled by the Rosewood HOA." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "We have verified that the illegal discharge was funneled through a secondary channel connected to the neighborhood's original retention system, bypassing municipal oversight and directly impacting the watershed downstream." I stood near the back, arms crossed, heart pounding. They did it. Marlene went on listing the EPA statutes, violated the depth of soil contamination, the elevated levels of cadmium, lead, and nitrates found in both lake water and nearby wells. She didn't soften the blow. "This was not an accident," she said, pausing just long enough for it to land. "This was deliberate concealment and negligent endangerment. A full criminal referral has been submitted to the Department of Justice." That sentence hit like a brick. The crowd murmured louder now. Someone cursed under their breath. A woman whispered something sharp and panicked to her husband. And then, Marlene turned it over to the city's environmental engineer, who displayed a color-coded map showing the flow of contamination across 5 zones. Bright red lines pulsing out from the exact coordinates I had stood on when I filmed the pipe. They didn't just confirm the dump site. They traced it straight to the HOA. All of it. Every barrel, every pipe, every lie. Every signature that tied it back to Donald Travers and his fake shell company. It felt surreal. I remembered standing in the mud weeks ago, wondering if I was imagining it all. If I was the one losing it. But now, under that hot white tent, the truth stood tall in front of everyone. After the briefing, residents surrounded me like floodwaters. Some were furious. "Why didn't we see this coming?" Others were guilty. "Jack, I'm so sorry, I didn't believe you." A few, like Janice Reynolds, just hugged me and didn't say a word. The newly formed interim board held an emergency session that afternoon. They released a statement within hours, severing all ties with Rosewood Environmental Management, initiating a civil suit against Travers, and cooperating fully with federal investigators. They also froze all HOA spending and suspended dues collection until a full audit was complete. But the real explosion came that evening when the news broke. Channel 6 aired a 5-minute segment titled "Toxic Secrets: How One Man Exposed an HOA's Dirty Cover-Up." It opened with aerial drone footage of the lake now ringed in orange hazard tape, and then cut to stills of dead fish, scorched earth, where the maintenance shed once stood, and finally, me. I hadn't agreed to an interview, but they used public footage from the town hall. My voice echoed through the screen as I said, "They used our money to poison our land, our water, our children." Within hours, the story went viral. Local outlets picked it up first, then state media. By morning, it was on national platforms. The headline shifted from lake contamination to suburban HOA faces federal criminal probe. And just like that, the HOA became a symbol of unchecked power, of suburban greed, of what happens when ordinary people are silenced long enough to make something toxic grow behind the fence line. But for me, it was still personal. Because as satisfying as the exposure was, I wasn't done. The EPA filed formal criminal charges the next day. Travers was indicted on 5 counts. Illegal disposal of hazardous materials, falsification of environmental compliance reports, fraud and embezzlement of HOA funds, obstruction of a federal investigation, conspiracy to endanger public health. Warrants were issued. He was picked up at a motel outside Jacksonville trying to pay cash for a burner phone and a bus ticket. When the cuffs went on, Marlene texted me a single word: bagged. And yet, even as the federal gears started to turn, our community still had to live with the consequences. EPA signs went up around the lake. Danger. Contaminated water. No entry. Cleanup crews arrived in white suits and masks, cordoning off the stream paths, digging test pits into soil I'd once planted flowers on. They brought in filtration units, began the process of water remediation, and mapped the slow healing of the land. But it would take years. In the meantime, parents were afraid to let their kids play in the yard. Gardens were uprooted. Real estate prices tanked. A few families moved out entirely. The very people who ignored the truth now had to live in it. And I kept walking the perimeter. Every morning I traced the shoreline, now fenced off and guarded. I spoke with the crews, documented their progress, logged chemical readings posted on the public board. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I owed it to Janet, to Scout, to every resident who drank from a garden hose thinking the water was safe. Then one morning, a city official met me at my gate. He introduced himself with a nod, handed me a document, and said, "We're reclassifying the lake." I opened the folder. It was a designation, Federal Watershed Restoration Site number 297. At the bottom, in a box labeled Historical Catalyst, was my name. Jack McClellan, whistleblower and primary complainant. I stood there a long while after he left, staring out at the lake. It didn't look peaceful. It looked raw, open, healing. But beneath all that damage was still the place where Janet and I once sat under the pines, laughing about nothing. And I realized I hadn't just saved a lake. I'd reclaimed it. If the EPA had pulled back the curtain, the press lit it on fire. In the days following the indictment, the story spread like gasoline on asphalt. Major outlets picked it up: CNN, MSNBC. Even the New York Times ran a feature titled, "When the Suburbs Go Toxic, the HOA Dumping Scandal of Rosewood Estates." By the end of the week, I couldn't go to the grocery store without someone recognizing me. "You're that lake guy, right? Hey, we saw you on the news. Thank you for standing up. Are you really the one who exposed the whole HOA?" And every time I just gave a tired nod. I hadn't done it for attention. But the attention came anyway. At first, I tried to lay low. The lake was still cordoned off now with EPA fencing and hazardous zone, federal property signs strung between steel poles. The crew in hazmat suits continued their daily grind, filtering soil, pumping water, testing algae blooms. But then the town woke up. And I mean really woke up. Parents began showing up to the school board demanding answers. What had their kids been exposed to? Why hadn't the HOA reported any risks earlier? One mother brought in a file of pediatric visits for rashes and ear infections dating back 2 years. Another father started a Change.org petition demanding a state investigation into other HOAs in the county. The petition reached 50,000 signatures in 3 days. The new HOA board, formed after Travers and the old guard were ousted, tried to get ahead of it, offering apologies, cooperating with investigators, even proposing community restitution. But no apology could put clean water back in the lake. No goodwill could undo years of lies. A neighborhood that once prided itself on pristine lawns and trimmed hedges now stood bare and raw, like a wound waiting to scab over. Yard signs began popping up like mushrooms. No more silence. "We stand with Jack. Real accountability now." That one stopped me in my tracks. Not because I liked the attention, but because I didn't know anyone was standing with me at all. For weeks, I'd walked through this battle feeling like a ghost, ignored, dismissed, mocked. And now here were families, people who'd once waved politely and looked away, now speaking out loud, refusing to be complicit. The press fueled it further. A local radio show asked me to speak. I said no. Then a reporter named Ella Simmons from the Times called. Not the front page kind, the human interest type. She wanted to tell the story not of the crime, but of the man behind it. "I want to understand why you kept going," she said over the phone. "Why you didn't quit when they threatened you. Why you didn't stop when everyone else turned away." I sat quiet for a long moment. Then I told her about Janet, how she used to call the lake our anchor, how I watched it turn from mirror to poison and couldn't bear to let that be the end of our story. Ella's article dropped the following week. It opened with a photo of me standing by the dock, back straight, Scout at my side. The lake in the background, roped off and still reflecting the sky like nothing had changed. The headline read, "Share the man who fought the water. One veteran's battle to save his community." It was raw, honest. She didn't frame me as a hero, just a man who refused to look away. And that made all the difference. From there, things moved fast. A group of environmental lawyers offered pro bono representation for families affected by the contamination. Lawsuits started piling up not just against Travers, but against the contractors who had dumped waste, the companies who looked the other way, and even the management firm that processed the HOA's finances. The city council scheduled an emergency meeting which quickly turned into a standing room-only event. Marlene was invited to speak. She did so calmly, like she always did, laying out facts like bricks in a wall. But the emotion came from the people. One by one, residents stepped up. A teenage girl talked about losing her dog. An elderly man wept while describing how he used to water his vegetable garden with lake runoff. A nurse brought in anonymized charts showing an uptick in respiratory issues in children under 10 within a 2-mile radius of the lake. And then Elise Franklin, my neighbor, the retired school teacher, stood up. She held a mason jar full of water. Yellow-brown, sludgy. "I took this from the shore the day before the EPA closed it off," she said. "This was the water behind our homes. This was what we were told was safe." She held the jar up. "We believed them, because we trusted them." The room was dead silent. Then she turned to me. "And we didn't believe you," she said, "but you kept fighting anyway." I couldn't look at her. My throat closed up too tight. Afterward, people filed out slowly. Some stayed behind to speak to reporters, others just lingered, processing the collapse of everything they'd thought was normal. But something had changed. The town was no longer in denial. It was awake. That night, someone knocked on my door. It was Priya Shah, the resident, who'd helped dissolve the old board. She held a clipboard in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. "We're starting a recovery committee," she said. "Residents, scientists, legal advisors. We're going to build a new system, Jack. Transparent, accountable." She handed me a packet. "I want you on it." I hesitated. I was tired. Old bones, long nights. But something in her voice told me this wasn't about meetings and policies. This was about making sure it never happened again. I took the packet. "I'll read it." She smiled. "That's a yes." Scout wagged his tail behind me. When she left, I sat back on the porch and looked out at the water, now illuminated by a security floodlight. And I realized the damage had been done. But so had something else. Something I never expected to see again after Janet passed. Hope. It crept back in. Quiet, resilient. Like a spring bubbling beneath scorched ground, refusing to die. It's strange the way healing begins. Not with noise, but with quiet. Not with cheers or headlines, though we had plenty of both. It began with the sound of gravel crunching beneath the boots of men in hazmat suits, carting out the last of the contaminated sediment. It began with a city worker kneeling by the streambed, planting the first of 1,000 bulrushes and water lilies. It began when the lake, my lake, reflected something clean again. But it didn't come easy, and it didn't come fast. The process stretched on for months. Federal remediation contracts were awarded. A full groundwater monitoring system was installed. The entire area was designated a restoration priority zone, with all the scrutiny and bureaucracy that came with it. And every week, someone in a suit would show up with a clipboard and a drone and ask to walk the perimeter. But I didn't mind. I walked it too. I kept my own log weather patterns, wildlife sightings, algae bloom levels. The ducks returned first, then the frogs, then the fish stocked by an EPA aquatics team after the levels tested safe. They released fingerlings into the cove on a cloudy Wednesday morning. I stood with Scout at the edge of the dock and watched them swim. I didn't cry, but my hands trembled the whole time. Meanwhile, the legal fallout continued to unfold. Donald Travers pled guilty. The evidence was too overwhelming. Between the forged invoices, the buried safe, and the EPA's chain of custody, his lawyers had no wiggle room. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he gave up everything. His partners, the companies he colluded with, even the brokers who laundered the HOA payments through shell firms. He stood before a federal judge in a crisp suit, looking 10 pounds lighter and 20 years older, and tried to make excuses. I didn't think it would spread that far. I just wanted to keep dues low. It wasn't supposed to get out of hand. But the judge wasn't interested in excuses. "You endangered a community," she said. "You defiled public trust, and you poisoned a lake." Travers was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, plus restitution and lifetime banishment from holding any fiduciary position in a residential association. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to. Justice, when real, doesn't need witnesses to matter. Meanwhile, the new HOA board, under Priya's leadership, started rewriting the rules from the ground up. Transparency clauses were enacted. Environmental audits made mandatory. A whistleblower protection section was added to the bylaws bearing my name. The McClellan Clause. They said it was symbolic. I said I didn't need it. But I smiled anyway. The EPA issued a formal certificate declaring the lake safe for non-potable recreation 6 months after the final dredging. No swimming just yet, but kayaking, fishing, and shoreline use were permitted. The sign they installed at the lakefront wasn't flashy. Just a simple wooden board engraved with Rosewood Lake, protected and reclaimed. Underneath it, restored with gratitude to Jack McClellan, resident and whistleblower. People started calling it McClellan Lake. I never did. To me, it was just ours again. Janet's and mine. One morning, near the 1-year mark of the EPA's first visit, Priya knocked on my door again, this time with a city official, a video crew, and a gold-lettered certificate. Environmental Citizen of the Year, she read, holding it out. I looked at the frame. I saw Janet's reflection in the glass. Just for a second. Just long enough to feel her hand on my shoulder again. I didn't do this for awards, I said quietly. I know, Priya replied. That's why you deserve it. They took a few photos. I smiled in one. That was enough. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the dock with Scout. He's slower now, like me, but still sharp, still loyal. We sat in the fading light, the lake glistening soft gold beneath the sunset. A pair of herons landed across the water, long legs dipping gracefully as they searched for minnows. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, I breathed without tension. I thought back to the beginning, to the smell that set everything off, to the fish, the pipe, the threats, the fire, the boardroom lies, and the federal truths that followed. They poisoned my lake. They tried to bury me in silence. But I made them pay with the truth, with the law, and with every inch of grit I had left. And in the end, they didn't just lose their power. They gave the rest of us something stronger. A reason to fight. A reason to stand up. A reason to believe we're not helpless, not even in the face of people who think their fences can keep justice out. So I sat there, the wind moving softly through the reeds, Scout's head resting on my boot, and whispered to no one. You can poison a lake, but you can't poison the man who's willing to save it. And I closed my eyes and listened to the water come back to life.